All right, everybody, let's get started. Good afternoon and good morning, depending on where you're at. My name is Sean Gibson. I'm the great grandson of Josh Gibson and executive director of the Josh Gibson Foundation. We're excited to have you join us today for our speaker today, Mr. Kevin Johnson. This is our fifth year of the Josh Gibson webinar series. This series started back in 2020 during the pandemic to keep the people's interest of the Negro Leagues alive with having different speakers on variety topics of the Negro Leagues. And so we're excited to continue this into 2026. We'll be kicking off our session in February. If anybody's on this call that may be interested in being a speaker, if you haven't been one of our speakers or may know of a speaker, please have them contact myself, Ted, or Tom Kern. Again, we're excited today to have Mr. Johnson speak to us today. I have my co-hosts with me, Ted Noor and Tom Kern, who'll be working the chats for you guys. Any questions, they'll let you know how to do that. We'll go on the chat. So without further ado, I will turn over to Ted, introduce our speaker.
Folks, good to see you all here. I'm going to introduce Kevin Johnson, who's a good friend, colleague. He's an advisor to me and, and a research assistant. A graduate of St. Louis University, he co chairs, very appropriately for today's talk, SABR's Ballpark Committee, and he's a co creator of Seamheads, and his title, which he doesn't use, is Integrity Manager. It's all yours, Kevin.
Thanks, Ted. Thanks for that great introduction. Although I have to correct you, it's not St. Louis University where I went to, but Washington University in St. Louis.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, but I want to thank the Josh Gibson Foundation for inviting me to speak, and of course, I want to thank everyone who's joined to listen to me talk about something I'm somewhat passionate about. I do some ballparks research and I do some Negro Leagues research. And so the intersection of those two is kind of my sweet spot of baseball research. So I'm pretty excited about that. I think most of the people on this call probably know about the Seamheads database, but a little background of where we're at right now is that this is a database that's been built over multiple decades and with multiple researchers contributing. And this year we've kind of made a special uh, effort, and primarily that means Gary Asheville has done most of the work, to really go back to some of the older seasons and kind of re-review them, uh, try to take some of our modern tools, digitize newspapers and things, and perhaps either find new box scores or find box scores for games where previously maybe we only had one box score and the box score wasn't that great. And now we can find multiple box scores and kind of enhance some of the data. So with all that effort this year, I kind of feel like we're at the point where the data is fairly stable, the game level data especially, where we can start doing some analysis on the players and on ballparks. And so what you're going to see here is, I think, new information. As far as I know, no one's done anything quite like this. And we're going to focus on the components of the ballpark, components meaning singles, doubles, triples, and home runs. And we'll primarily focus on home runs, just because that's the thing people seem to be the most interested in, and just that we don't want to go for 3 hours here. So with that, I'm going to talk a little bit. This is kind of basic probably for this group, but why do Negro League park factors even matter? Well, we know parks do impact the offensive context, both positively and negatively. We know today in modern baseball, that the Colorado Rockies are playing in a little bit different offensive context than the Seattle Mariners. So offensive context does impact the various batting components, and it impacts scoring. And batting components and scoring, of course, impact then the players and the team statistics that we end up compiling. Because baseball, especially us researchers, statistics are kind of important to us, and how we go about then taking those player statistics really impact our understanding of the players themselves and the teams. And this, you can see here, this is a picture of Rickwood Field back when it was first built. You can see, and if you know a little bit about Rickwood, it had very deep dimensions, which would have impacted how teams played there. And the one thing I didn't bullet point here is the context also impacts some of the strategy, the manager strategy, and how the team, whether the team plays for, what we call small ball and plays for one run at a time or not. So that's something also, excuse me, to keep in mind as we go through this presentation, that some of the Negro League managers might have been, their strategy might have been impacted by the ballparks they were playing in. All right, so we do have some special considerations for Negro League park factors, and one of the big ones is the sample size, just the sheer number of games played in a park. And I'm going to primarily talk about major games, major black ball games, not because the other games that the Negro League teams played against semi-pro and other teams is not important. But it's just because we try to compare apples to apples as much as possible. But if you're familiar with Seamheads, you can actually kind of choose whether you want to include, let's say, the Monarchs games against the Kansas City Blues, the minor league team, or not. We're still kind of compiling some of the non-major black ball versus black ball team games. But if we just look at the games we would call kind of major or major league, you can see these are some AL and NL parks that are from the past, and you can see how many games were played at those parks through, I think this is actually through 2024, at the various parks, 7,000, 4,000. And then you look down here, and these are the number of games, and I only include for these numbers the games where we actually have box scores. So Shoreling Park in Chicago, which used to be called Southside Park when the White Sox played there, had the most Negro League games played in that venue. And you can see Mulebach Field in Kansas City, Stars Park in St. Louis, Mack Park in Detroit. I went ahead and included our Cuban box score, so Almendares Park is included on this list. Hilldale Park in the Philadelphia area, and 44th and Parkside in the Philadelphia area. Rickwood Park, Birmingham, Lewis Park, or sometimes Martin Field in Memphis, and Maryland Park in Baltimore. So those are the ones you can see pretty quickly. The number of games you have to even do any kind of statistical analysis kind of drops pretty quickly there, because one, there were fewer major games in the Negro League season. And the second thing is they sometimes moved around as far as where they played. They didn't always play in their home park. They played in neutral parks, or they went barnstorming and those kind of things. So just the sheer number of games is one consideration. Another special consideration is the schedules. The Negro League teams played imbalanced home away schedules. And as I mentioned, they played sometimes at neutral sites. So just looking at if you took the Chicago Cubs from 1928, they played 154 games They split that actually evenly between home games and road games. So they played 77 games in Wrigley Field, and then they played 11 games at each of the parks of the other teams in the National League. So it's very much a balanced schedule. And if we wanted to calculate a simple park factor, we generally assume that the road games kind of average out to a neutral park. Some would be a little bit better for hitting, some would be better for pitching. It's not a terrible assumption. So if the Cubs and their opponents, which they did, hit home runs at a rate 42% higher in Wrigley Field than they did in Cub road games, what we would generally do is we would say, well, Wrigley Field would have a park factor of 142 based on an index of 100 being average. The road parks that they played in would have, if we just assume average, 100. We divide by 2 and we say that the batters for the 1928 Cubs were in an environment that had a park factor of 121, or in other words, it was 21% more favorable than average for those batters. So pretty simple. We can make a lot of simplifying assumptions. Now, when we get to the Negro Leagues, it's a little different. If we just look at the 1928 Chicago American Giants, same city, they played 110 games against the other Negro National League teams, but they didn't split those 55 and 55. They played 76 games at home at Shoreling Park. They played 12 games at St. Louis Stars Park, and they played 9 games in Kansas City at Mulebach Park, 5 games over at Cleveland, Luna Park, 4 games down in Birmingham at Rickwood, 4 games over at Detroit Mack Park, and 2 at Memphis Lewis Park. So as you can see, the schedule is not really balanced. And of course, there was reasons for that. Teams were willing to play more games in Chicago instead of just splitting their home, their games evenly between home and road, primarily because bigger crowds and more money. So a lot of teams in the league, like Detroit, they would play more games in Chicago than they would play in Detroit against the American Giants. And there were some other factors too. A lot of the northern teams didn't particularly care to go down to Birmingham and Memphis too many times. So they generally would only make one trip for the season down to through Memphis and down to Birmingham and back, which again means some imbalanced scheduling. Birmingham and Memphis ended up playing each other quite a bit, just because of travel cost and also because of probably Jim Crow. Teams didn't want to go down there. So if you look at this little chart, try to chart it out. Chicago, for their 110 games, 69% were played at Shoreling, and you see 9% were played at Stars Park, 8% Kansas City, etc. And each of those parks was unique. And so we'll talk more about that. And another consideration, there were more parks with greater variances in their impact on scoring. And what I mean by that is that if you just look at the history of the AL and NL, everybody knows, whatever park the Colorado Rockies were playing in helps offense because of the altitude. We know through history, let's say Baker Bowl in Philadelphia was very favorable for offense. And then we know there's certain parks that were definitely pitcher friendly. Yankee Stadium, for instance, or Shea Stadium. But if you look at the overall ALNL throughout history, most of the parks are actually not that far away from kind of being average. There's those, like I said, there's those outliers like Coors Field, but the overall distribution or variance is actually fairly tight. But when you get to the Negro Leagues, you've got all kinds of different parks. You've got, again, parks like Shoreling and Mulebach in Kansas City, which, of course, were used in the American League by American League teams at different points in history. So those were definitely, we'd call major league parks. And there were other parks like Luna Field in Cleveland. If we saw it today, we'd probably say it wasn't even a great high school park. So the size and the way that the parks they played in impacted scoring had kind of a greater variance. There were more extreme parks. And one example I always like to use is the 1928 Negro National League Championship. It was between the St. Louis Stars and the Chicago American Giants. They played a series at the end of the year for the championship. There was no Negro League World Series that year. Well, this thing wanted to jump ahead on me. Not going to do it. Okay. Anyway, what I wanted to show, I was going to show one at a time, but you see these scores in the first games they were played at Shoreling Park, and they're fairly low scoring games, 10 runs, 3 runs, 9 runs. And then they shifted to St. Louis, the Stars Park. The first game wasn't too bad, but after that, you see 19 runs, 16 runs, 23 runs, 11 runs. Well, it wasn't that the batters just kind of heated up. It was probably the change in the park. Shoreling was definitely a pitcher's park, depressed offense, and Stars Park, with its Fenway-like left field, definitely increased scoring and home runs. All right, so what's the methodology? I'm going to kind of skim over this. Don't want to get too boring here, get into the details. But basically, the way I've done the park factors is I start with all games over the life of the park. So it's really over the entire life of the park factor to start with. And then I calculate ratios of how every team batted in that park versus how they batted in every other park in that season. And the reason we have to go through all this is that the whole imbalance schedule, and that it's not really simple where you can just take home and road and divide by 2. You kind of have to figure out the distribution of the parks and where they played and how many games and how to weight those. So basically, you take Chicago, the American Giants in 1928. How'd they do in Shoreling? As far as singles, doubles, triples, home runs, walks. Compare it to how they batted in Stars Park. You create a ratio between those 2 parks, and you do that for every park, every pair of parks they played in, and then you do the same thing for the St. Louis Stars. How they batted in Shoreling Park, compare how they batted in Cleveland and Luna Park, and you create a ton of pairs. And then you have to weight those somehow, because sometimes you might have, of course, your home park, you might have played 50 games there, and you're creating a ratio against another park where you only played 2 games. So there's a way to handle that. I call it the harmonic mean method, but there's a way that you kind of weight the plate appearances. You sum all those ratios across all teams and all years, and then I apply a regression to the mean. Because again, you got to do some regression if you're familiar with statistics. Again, because we don't have those big of samples, sometimes teams only played 1 game in a park for the entire year. They just happen to go and play a neutral site game. So there's a lot of regression to the mean. And then the final step is you kind of have to retrofit those park factors that you created for the life of the park back into each particular season, because you want each season has to average to 100, an index of 100 for singles, home runs, etc. So there is an adjustment made. So that's how I do it. I won't claim that it's the perfect method, but given all those kind of challenges that you have with the Negro Leagues, I think it's a reasonable method. But I'm open to anyone who can come up with something better. All right, I'm going to camp on this one just for a little bit. What I have over here is a list of all the most used venues for major Negro League games. And if you notice, the number here for Shoreling is a little bit different than the earlier number, and that's just because this number is all games that we have, not just games that we have box scores for. So I wanted a list of all the most used venues here in the Negro Leagues. And I'm primarily, I should have mentioned this earlier, primarily focused on 1920 through 1948 here, where we have really good game level data. But I'm not going to read through all these, but I'll just note